Today is July 31st, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's important to note that today is the memorial of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, who was very influential in my discovery of the classical liberal arts. As I focused on the historical work of the Jesuits and their schools, I gained a real admiration for St. Ignatius. And as I talk today about a subject that I know was very dear to him, namely the Catechesis of Catholics, I trust in his intercession that in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, as we continue to work, we will succeed in providing access to great catechesis for Catholic students of all ages. And as I said, that's going to be the subject of this talk today. I'd like to talk about real Catholic catechesis. What is needed for the catechesis or religious formation of Catholics? Now, this is a subject that's personally very important to me as a father with 10 children. My wife and I converted to Catholicism in the midst of our family life. We already had 5 children, and so with our first few children, we went through their childhood really learning the faith ourselves and implementing the Catholic faith as far as we could. And as time goes on, we've continued to study and devote a great deal of our time and energy to Catholic catechesis. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, it's my goal to have the Academy really become a place that offers the richest and best catechesis available anywhere. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit, because I believe that there's a lot of ignorance with respect to Catholic catechesis. There's a lot of opinion, a lot of emotion, but not a lot of actual understanding or effort invested in study. Even in the Academy, as much as we're a Catholic study program, most of the parents, foolishly, no matter what I say, end up focusing on modern subjects like math and science, and catechesis gets tacked on awkwardly as some kind of elective in the Catholic curriculum. We see this also in many Catholic schools, Catholic parishes, where you've got families just all over the place, kids in public schools and non-Catholic private schools, and then you've just got these faith formation programs sort of stuck on like extracurricular activities. And that's just not what catechesis is. And so I'd like to talk about this a little bit, because I think I can make it pretty clear, and then not only can I clarify and explain what Catholic catechesis needs to be authentic Catholic catechesis, but I think I can explain how we can actually practice this, and how the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is working to make such a program available to Catholic families. And I don't want to focus entirely on children, because it's not just children who need to be catechized. That's one of the false ideas about catechesis, is it's something for kids. We all need to be catechized. Catechesis is ongoing. It needs to continue throughout our entire Catholic lives, because the Catholic faith is profound. And just because you've learned enough to participate doesn't mean you're now finished and you can just go play. So I'd like to talk about what catechesis actually is. I'd like to talk about how the Church teaches us to pursue catechesis, the resources the Church gives us for the work of catechesis, how we misuse and misunderstand catechesis, and then how we can actually get it right, because it should be the central focus of our children's education, because as the old Jesuit schools used to say, the mission of our work in education, as far as our concern is with education as parents and teachers, the goal is to lead our students to know and love their Creator and Redeemer. That's the goal. St. Paul in Romans says, all things work for the good of those who love God. That implies that not all things work for the good of those who don't love God. And so in order to bring our children into that blessed life where all things work for their good, we need to lead them to love God, because that's the group for whom it said all things work for their good. So we have to begin, and let me just say, what the Church provides us in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Church provides us with everything we need. It's really amazing what the modern Church has accomplished. I know it's cool for some on the internet, idlers, to criticize the modern Church, but if you can put on enough virtue to get yourself past that silly gossip culture and actually look at what the Church has provided us in the past 20 years, it's quite amazing. After the Second Vatican Council, the bishops of the Church knew that a new catechesis was needed to help equip Catholics for life in the modern world. And if you don't believe that that's true, you simply disagree with the doctors of the Church. For example, St. Gregory of Nyssa, who's not, I don't think he's considered a doctor in the Latin Church, but he is respected as one of the great fathers of the Christian faith. He explained in his work called The Great Catechesis that we need to understand the truth of the gospel so that we can then introduce it to different people in different ways, because different people come from different backgrounds and they struggle with different aspects of the Catholic faith. So for example, and this is his explanation, he says, an atheist coming to Catholicism will struggle with the question of the existence of God. And so we will need to understand how to introduce an atheist to theism, to the belief in God. A polytheist, someone who believes in a multitude of gods, will come to the Catholic faith with a different set of problems. He won't have a problem believing in God like the atheist does, but he'll have different problems. He'll have different problems that need to be addressed and given different emphasis. In modern society, someone who comes to the Church as a materialist, someone who comes from a strong background in natural sciences, someone who comes to the Catholic faith from another religious background, a Protestant Christian background, a Hindu background, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, and so on, they can't be given the same catechism program. And the Church wisely worked between 1982, I believe, and 1985 and 1982 to put together a new universal catechism. And that's what we see in this big fat green book that's published by the Church. We see the Universal Catechism, which is not intended to be a catechism program for all individuals. It's really a source for catechisms to be developed to serve different needs in different places, and so on. And so in America, the American bishops in the Catholic Church have recently published a work called the U.S. Catechism for Catholic Adults. And it's based on the Universal Catechism, but it is intended for American Catholics. That's what the purpose of the Universal Catechism really was. Excuse me. So when we look at that big fat green catechism, that's sort of the master manual of the Catholic faith, and then figuring out how to take that and present the truth of that catechism to different people, where we'll need to focus on different things in different prioritized order and so on. That's the challenge that we face as individual Catholics and preachers and catechists and so on. So that's what we need to learn as Catholics. We need to study the Universal Catechism to know the full Catholic faith in all its detail. But then as we minister and evangelize different individuals, different groups that we happen to be in contact with, we need to think of how that Universal Catechism should be presented to different groups. That's the challenge we face. So as parents, we've got the challenge of catechizing our own children. We've got the challenge of catechizing ourselves. If we get into actual parish ministry, we may have to catechize children in our parishes who may come from different backgrounds. In our parish, for example, we have a very, very great Hispanic population. Almost all of the Hispanic children go to public schools and come to church for faith formation and sacraments. So that's a real dilemma. Different parishes in different places have different socioeconomic backgrounds. You can see it's very complicated. And that's why there are individual parishes, to try and address those local challenges. But what I'd like to focus on is what the Catechism, the Universal Catechism, actually teaches us about catechesis, about the Catholic life, so that we can understand what I think are the key principles, and then can begin to think about how to actually use the Catechism and do the work of catechesis in an intelligent and faithful way. So if we study the Catechism, and I encourage you to study the Catechism in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We've got the entire Catechism available for study in a Catechism of the Catholic Church course. We've got the U.S. Catechism for Catholic Adults available on the Academy website. We've got a number of other resources, sacred scripture programs, and some other stuff I'll talk about later. But everything that you need is available on the Academy Theology Study Center. And I encourage you to make use of it, because it gives us a place to gather and work on these things. But if we look at the Catechism, it begins with a talk about God's revelation of himself. And it explains that man, every single human being, is created by God, and most importantly, for God. In other words, our end, the purpose for which we're created, the end that explains why we are made the way that we are. The purpose of our life is found in God himself. And so every human being is seeking God. Sort of like if you take a stone and throw it up into the air. As soon as that stone leaves your hand, it begins seeking to return to its natural place. And we, in this world, as individuals, are like stones thrown up into the air. We may be at all different points of the journey of that stone. Some of us are still in the hand, as it were. Some have just left the hand. Some are reaching that peak of movement where we almost come to a stop. Others are beginning to move back to where they belong. Others have reached the ground and are at rest, as they should be. But we're all on this journey at different points, and we're obviously different from a stone because we have free will. We can choose to keep moving away from God if we wish to. But our nature is created. What we are as human beings only can find meaning when it is united to God as its last end. And so all human beings, and we know all the quotes from church fathers, all human beings, to some degree, whether they understand it or not, are seeking God. I've heard it explained, for example, that the reason why human beings are so prone to addiction and destructive behaviors is because the desires that we've been created with are so strong, because they are intended to be satisfied in only God himself. And so we were given passions and desires that are like containers that are so great that they're impossible to fill, because they were created to be filled by the Creator himself, the eternal, infinite, unchanging, almighty God himself. We're created to be satisfied by this infinitely satisfying being. And if we don't seek satisfaction in him, our desires can lead us to destruction because they're so intense. But all human beings are seeking what can only be found in God. Whether it's love, whether it's wealth, whether it's life and health, freedom from pain, power, influence, honor, whatever it may be, whatever moves an individual, that desire is ultimately fulfilled in God himself. This is what we are. This is our nature. And so the Catechism teaches us that there are 3 ways that this is revealed to us. This truth is revealed to us in 3 ways. We're not like Oedipus in classical literature, this baby that's carried out and left on a mountain by itself to figure out its own purpose in life. God continually reveals himself to us, and he does so in 3 different ways. God reveals himself to us and allows us to find our end, to find our way in 3 different ways. The first is through creation, through the world around us. If we look around us in the natural world, what we see is that the world is not a place of chaos. The world is not a place where random things just explode and are destroyed and change constantly at random. The world around us is orderly and purposeful. There's routine in the world around us. There are 4 seasons that come and go every year. Seed time and harvest. There are hours of the day. There's sunrise and sunset, and it's routine. It's always the same. It's like a watch that has been created and set and wound up by an intelligent designer. And we can see that there is intelligence in the natural world. We can see that there's order in the natural world. If we deny that there is intelligence in the world, we're left trying to find some replacement theory to explain what we see. We end up with something like evolution. And evolution simply doesn't work because the world is too complex. The order is too profound. And in order to deal with that order, in order to explain how the order could have arisen at the level of complexity and universality that we see it, the only way that we could explain how that could possibly develop naturally is by multiplying the time to just absurdly incomprehensible numbers, to say billions and billions of years, for this complexity to actually come to be. It's like taking a stack of cards and throwing the cards into the air and asking, if I take this stack of cards, let's say they're all organized, and I throw them into the air, what's the chance that they can all fall to the ground and reorder themselves in the exact same order that they were thrown in? And we might figure out, all of the different options that could possibly happen if we just throw this deck of cards high into the air and let all the cards fall to the ground. What's the probability that we'll throw them into the air and they'll fall back to the ground in exactly the same order that they were originally in? And we can start running these calculations and we can find, well, it would be extremely difficult for that to happen. But if we did it, let's say 700 trillion times, it might happen. And so then we say, oh yeah, so that explains the order in the universe, that this order could arise from total chaos if it was allowed to, run itself out, let's say 4.5 billion times or some infinite number of times. And so that relative infinity of time becomes a way of explaining how the order that we all observe in the natural world could have come to be without an intelligent designer. And we've got to ask the question, is that actually a more reasonable, more probable explanation than intelligent design or intelligent theism? That the world and the order that we observe in the world was designed by some intelligent divine being. So the first way that we can learn about God is by studying the world. And in ancient philosophy, this was called natural philosophy, where we seek to understand the order that can be discerned in the natural world. That's the purpose of natural philosophy. So that's the first way we can learn about God. And we all have those experiences where we catch a sunrise or a sunset, or we stand on a mountain top and overlook the land, and we just say, oh my, it's so breathtakingly beautiful. There's something about it that fills my soul with praise for the Creator. And there's just no other way around it. That realization that the heavens declare the glory of God, that is one of the ways by which we come to learn of our Creator in this life. That's the first way. The second way is through ourselves. The second way God reveals himself to us is by our own consideration of our own human nature. It's important to note that if you'd like to read something interesting on this topic, if you read one of Plato's dialogues, and I don't recommend Plato very often, but this is one dialogue that I think is interesting. His dialogue, First Alcibiades. This is the theme of First Alcibiades. It's the question, basically, what is man? And Socrates, through his method, leads Alcibiades, a young Athenian politician, to consider what exactly human nature is. And he comes to this conclusion that man is made in the image of God, that he's a divine being, that he possesses characteristics not present in the animals, but that could only be present in some divinity. And so he explains that when a man looks in a mirror, he is looking at God, not in some direct idolatrous sense, but in the sense that he is looking at the most perfect image of God that exists in the world is looking at you in the mirror. And so through the study of ourselves, we come to know God by thinking about our own qualities, our own virtues as human beings, those unique qualities that distinguish us from all other creatures, namely our souls, our mind, reason, will, and so on. by reflecting on those things and thinking about the implications of those things, thinking about what those things revealed to us about not just ourselves, but about our Creator. That if these things distinguish us from other creatures, then God himself must be like us in these things, but at the same time, he must also be separate from us, superior to us in these things. And meditating through the implications of that is the purpose of human philosophy, the study of ourselves. And this has always been a subject of classical philosophy. So the second source by which God reveals himself to us is through human nature itself, because we were created in his image, and therefore we can use ourselves as sort of a tutor to help us think about God. Now, if you study the history of philosophy, you'll learn that one of the arguments that modern philosophers make against Christians, against ancient philosophy and so on, is this habit of seeking to know God by meditating on our own human nature. This is called anthropomorphism in philosophy, where we think about God in human terms. And philosophers like David Hume and Baruch Spinoza criticize us for this. They criticize ancient philosophers and Christians for thinking about God in human terms. And this is how they move towards pantheism, where God is not like a man. He's not thought of in human terms. He's thought of in entirely different terms, and that leads to pantheism, where we're actually parts of this universal substance which is divine and blah, blah, blah. That pantheism comes from an attempt to understand God without comparing him to man. Now, that argument makes sense. That's a good theory, that we should think about God as entirely other than man. That's a good argument, but if God did in fact make man in his own image, then it's not a good argument, because it's actually true that God left us with a popcorn trail through the woods, as it were, in our own nature. And by examining ourselves, we could find these little types and shadows of the divine nature itself, and use our own self-knowledge to lead us to our Creator. So that modern philosophical argument against anthropomorphism, while it in itself is a fair argument, it leads to pantheism. But if God has in fact made man in his likeness, then anthropomorphism actually is a proper means to seek the knowledge of God. So that's the second way that we learn about God, by studying ourselves. And then the third way, that the greatest and most significant way, is by God's own self-revelation. God simply reveals himself to us directly. Now, when we think of ancient philosophy, we basically have men in the ancient world seeking to know God by the first two means, by the study and contemplation of the natural world, and by the study and contemplation of human nature. That's basically what the ancient philosophers did. So if you read Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and so on, that's what they're doing. They're seeking to learn about the divine being, about the divine nature, through the contemplation of creation and human nature. When we go to Israel and we find God revealing himself to a chosen people, we have a different means of knowledge of God. We have divine revelation. Now, thankfully, the content of divine revelation, of ancient divine revelation, was contained for us in the Jewish scriptures. The Jews wrote it down. And this, of course, begins with Moses and the 5 books of Moses, which include a divinely inspired account of creation of the natural world and of human beings. And so now in the context of philosophy, you can see how significant the opening chapters of Genesis are. It's actually God directing us in all of that work of philosophy. So we've got in the opening books of Genesis an account of the creation or origin of the world. We see that it is most certainly created by an intelligent divine being. We see the creation of man. We see that man is most certainly created by an intelligent divine being. And we also see that man is explicitly said to be made in the image and likeness of God. So we have anthropomorphism confirmed by the book of Genesis, that is actually a right way of thinking about God. And then we go into the whole history of mankind on earth with the temptation and the fall. We're also introduced to other inhabitants in this world. So it's not just man and living animals and plants. We're also introduced to spiritual beings that are not divine, but are also not bodily. We're introduced to angels and to demons and evil spirits. We're introduced to Satan and so on. This is especially true in the book of Job, where we see the life of a good man, the life of a righteous man, that humanly speaking, philosophically speaking, makes no sense. And the only way to make sense out of it is to have the curtains opened for us, as it were, so that we can see into the invisible world of spiritual beings, to understand what's going on in earthly affairs. And so we have that look behind the curtains, as it were, in the book of Job, but all through the scriptures, because we see even in the Garden of Eden, we see that there's a serpent, and the serpent is speaking, and we've got this mysterious story of the temptation and fall of man and the origin of evil and all these important philosophical concepts. And what God basically does for us in divine revelation is tells us the answers to the philosophical questions directly. And that's why divine revelation is the greatest means by which we can learn about our Creator, His will, what we are, what our circumstances are, what we need to do, what our end is, and so on. So divine revelation, primarily found in the sacred scriptures, is our guide, is God's own merciful gift of revelation of the truth to us. It's considered to be a means of bypassing the work of human philosophy, but it's not intended to be all sufficient on its own. It leaves many questions for philosophy because they're within our grasp, and it provides us with many starting principles from which we can reason or philosophize with some certainty by trusting in the truths that are revealed to us. So we've got these three means by which we can come to know God. We've got the study of the natural world, the study of human nature, and the study of divine revelation, which continues into the New Testament, most perfectly being made in the person of Christ himself in the incarnation, where God actually comes and dwells among us and reveals himself perfectly as a man in the clearest terms. And then we've got the work of the apostles, whereby the life and teaching of Christ is explained and clarified, the formation of the church, the establishment of the magisterium, which continues to this day and goes on, not with new revelation. There is no new revelation after Christ, nor will there ever be. There is no more revelation, but there is an ongoing work of studying and understanding and explaining what has been revealed, and that is the work of the church, and that works itself out under the direction of divine providence in space and time. So it's living, and it's, I would say, deepening, but it's not growing in that there are new revelations. It's growing in the sense that what has been revealed is more perfectly understood and more fully applied in the life of the church and in the individual lives of all Christians. So what we see is the ultimate destiny of man is to find what he is longing for, is to actually rest in perfect satisfaction of human nature. And that rest is eternal life. That's why heaven is referred to as God's rest, where we will rest. Rest from our yearning, rest from our seeking, rest from our searching, rest from our sense of emptiness. Think of how in the Salve Regina we speak of this life as a valley of tears. It's a valley of tears because we are never able to be happy in this life, never capable of finding lasting peace and happiness. We're always seeking. David in the Psalms uses the illustration of a deer in the woods thirsting for running streams of water. So my soul thirsts for you. David says, there is nothing on earth I desire besides you. That constant human longing for God, which for most human beings is just an inexplicable yearning for something, yearning for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that yearning is in us because we are designed to be restless, as St. Augustine says, until we finally rest in God. Again, I think it's David in the Psalms who says, as a child in its mother's arms, so my soul. In other words, as a baby who feels as if he has everything he needs in the world when he is in his mother's arms. David says, that's how my soul feels in the presence of God. I feel like a baby in its mother's arms. I have everything I need, all my comfort, all my nourishment, everything that there's nothing else that I would desire than to be right here in my mother's arms. That's the feeling of salvation. That's the feeling of rest in God, which our soul seeks. So we have this constant uneasiness. We have this constant feeling that we're not settled, that we're not where we should be, that we're not home, that we're not at our destination. And that torments us all through life. And we're supposed to learn from that and ask, what exactly am I seeking? And this is what Aristotle takes up in Nicomachean Ethics. What is the purpose of my life? What is it that will actually give me this sort of lasting, permanent satisfaction that we call happiness? What is it? What am I actually created for? How can I figure it out? And where can I find it? How can I obtain it? That's the human quest. And it's true of every single human being because God has made us so. So that's presented to us at the beginning of the Catechism as the nature of this life, the nature of the human life. And we can get into all kinds of detail with that, but just as a general principle, that's the human condition. And God in his mercy has revealed to us in a number of different ways. He's revealed to us the answers to our questions. He's revealed them in the natural world, if we seek it. He's revealed them in our own nature, if we reflect on ourselves. And he's revealed it to us through the scriptures, through the church, by direct revelation. Our job as Christians now is to go into the world and preach this message of revelation, to preach this truth. And this truth is the gospel. This is the good news. The good news is that happiness is available to us, and it is in God, and it is given to us freely and generously by a God who not only created us, but loves us and desires for us to find our end, to reach our end and enjoy eternal happiness. That's the good news. The good news is God actually desires for you to experience and possess that happiness forever and ever and ever. That's the good news. And God has provided everything necessary for the realization of that happiness. And it's our duty as Christians to go into the world and preach this good news to all of these seeking, searching, lost, miserable, unsatisfied fellow human beings. So that's the human condition. That's the work of revelation. That's the mission of the church, the missionary mandate of the church. The great commission that Jesus gave his disciples is to go into the world and make disciples, baptize them into the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all that I've commanded you. That's the mission of the Christian church and of all Christians. And so now, as we understand our condition and receive this revelation, the question is, what are we to do with it? Like the jailer in the book of Acts asked St. Paul, what must we do to be saved? What must we actually do to be saved? And the answer that the church gives us is that we must respond to the gospel. We must respond to this revelation of God's plan of salvation for us, God's offer of salvation. We must respond to it in 4 different ways. We must respond to it in 4 different ways. We must believe the truth about God. We must worship God properly. We must live according to God's truth, according to God's will. And we must pray in a manner, again, appropriate, a manner that's proper for our relationship with God. So we must believe, we must worship, we must obey, and we must pray. And when we look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we find that these are the 4 divisions of the Catechism. The 4 divisions of the Catechism teach us in full detail how we are to respond to this message of God's love and offer of eternal happiness. Because if we do not respond rightly, we disqualify ourselves, because God will always honor our free will. He will always leave us in freedom to make our choices. He's willed to do so. We might wish that he would not do so. I've prayed at times, Lord, I just wish that you would give me salvation and make me holy and not leave it up to me. Like, can you just accept this one prayer as my final answer in this life? Can I just say, Lord, my will is for you to completely take over my life and treat me like a robot. I don't want free will. I don't want to be in control of my own life. I don't want to be tested. I don't want you to put me to the test every day in all these different situations. I don't want freedom. I want to be a slave with all of that freedom taken away, because I just want to please you and be saved. But God does not allow us off the hook that easily. He wants us to love him and to choose us freely in love. So the Catechism teaches us the 4 different aspects of our response to God's revelation of his plan of salvation. We must believe, we must worship, we must obey, and we must pray. And we must do all these things rightly. And this work of teaching people to understand their condition and teaching ourselves, because we never have this really figured out. We're always filled with blind spots. We always have gaps in our understanding. We always neglect different areas in practice. And so we have to constantly evangelize and catechize ourselves, but also our neighbors. It's to help us understand our condition as human beings, God's message to us through creation, through our own nature, and through divine revelation in the scriptures, that is, and to teach and to understand how we are to respond. That's the purpose of catechesis. And so when we look at the 4 different aspects of our response, we have 4 different divisions of catechesis. The faith, the sacraments, which is the system of worship that God himself has established and approved of. The moral life of the Christian faith, which God himself has revealed to us, taught, and modeled in the person of Christ. And the life of prayer, which again, Christ explicitly taught us how to pray. So we're not just left to ourselves, like some evangelicals would say, to respond, in our own way. No, that doesn't make any sense. We don't know how we should respond, and so responding in our own way would be stupid. In what area of life do we not seek to learn how we should do something? We don't just do it however we think it should be done or do it however we feel like doing it. We seek to know best practices. If I'm going to build a website, I don't just start as if no one has ever done this before, as if there's no consequences of different decisions and different methods. I know that there are experienced people who have learned by trial and error. There are people who are theoretical experts in web design and programming, who know what you should do, what you should not do, why you should do this and why you should not do this. That's the whole point of expertise. That's the whole point of experience and art. And so I want to know, what are the best practices? What are the ways that websites should be designed according to the experts that they've learned from experience and theory, to avoid unnecessary problems. And so we go and learn things. If I want to build something, if I want to build a deck on the back of my house, I don't just randomly start grabbing boards and nails and hammering things together and say, I'm just going to do it however I want. I go and learn. I get books or watch videos on how to build a deck, and I learn about how the foundation needs to be prepared and how the deck needs to be arranged and measured and planned, and why the measurements are what they are, why there are standard measurements and so on, what supplies are available, what kind of prefab supplies are available to minimize costs and to get things done as efficiently as possible. I have to learn about how it's going to be maintained and how to design it so that it can be easily maintained. No one just goes into projects and does whatever he thinks is fun. And yet we find that many people say that about religion, and it's just foolishness. It's arrogant and lazy. We want to learn how God wants to be worshipped, how God wants us to pray, how God wants us to live, and what God wants us to believe. It's not up to us. It's not up to us to design our own adventure and design our own religion, to have a personal relationship that we are. So that's just relativism. We want to know all about God's plan of salvation, and we also want to learn what God has taught us is necessary as far as our response is concerned. And so we find 4 parts of the catechism. The faith is part 1, and we focus on the Apostles' Creed. Because in the Apostles' Creed, we find the ancient expression of what we are to believe. And notice that it doesn't start with the words, God said blah, 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 and God teaches blah, 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 blah. The church teaches blah, blah. It doesn't say that. The Apostles' Creed says, I believe. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe in the Holy Ghost. And so we see that the Apostles' Creed doesn't simply present us with a body of teaching to be memorized. It actually requires us to express our belief in that truth. And so God explicitly teaches us what we are to believe, and we are to respond by saying, I believe, and listing the things that God himself has revealed for us to believe. And of course, that begins simply with the Apostles' Creed, expands to the Nicene Creed, and continues to expand over time until we get this whole massive Catechism of the Catholic Church, which we believe. So we're taught what to believe, and in the first part of the Catechism, we go through all of the details of the creed of the Church, whereby we respond rightly to God's message of salvation. We respond rightly with true and proper faith. And so you can see how significant it is every time that we recite the creed, because reciting the creed is the first part of our right response to the gospel. We say, I believe in what God has taught. God says that he is the creator of the world, the father of all creation, and we say, I believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth. We believe that. And so we actually respond rightly to the gospel by confessing the creeds, by reciting the creeds. Secondly, we have the 7 sacraments. We come to worship God. But we don't invent worship. In Henry V, King Henry, at the end of the play, says this famous line. His wife, the soon-to-be queen, is embarrassed because King Henry takes hold of her and wants to give her a kiss after his military victory, and she's resisting, saying like, no, this isn't proper manners. And King Henry says to her, he says, we make the manners. In other words, I'm the king. I'm the one who determines what the proper manners are in my kingdom. And that applies to this notion of worship. God is the only one who can determine what is proper for his worship, what is acceptable for his worship. He doesn't leave us to trial and error. He doesn't leave us to play hot and cold, to try to discern whether or not this is good or this is not good. He tells us explicitly what he wants us to do. And this is given to us through the sacraments of the Church. He established the Church in the New Testament. We see that. Protestants don't, unfortunately, but it's right there in the New Testament where Christ himself comes into the world and establishes a visible hierarchical church on earth, which is the instrument through which God's worship is going to be conducted on earth. And then he institutes the 7 sacraments. And those 7 sacraments are the signs and also the instruments through which the gifts that Christ wins for us by his obedience are administered to his followers in the world. Christ establishes those things. And so we learn what true worship is. True worship is worshiping God by means of the sacramental system that he himself established as proper, as the decent and orderly means by which we come to him, offer our worship, and receive the spiritual blessings of the gospel. So we learn about the 7 sacraments. And now you can see the second way that we respond rightly to the gospel is by participating in the sacramental life of the Church. So being baptized or having our children baptized, introducing a child to the true worship of God through the sacrament of baptism. That is the right response. Preparing for First Communion, receiving the Eucharist, going to confession and participating in the sacrament of reconciliation. With respect to relationships, going through the sacrament of matrimony as the foundation for family as it should be in God's sight, worshiping God properly, looking at the sacrament of holy orders as the means by which God's ministers are identified and officially called into the service of the church. We're not left to ourselves like Protestants to say, I think God's calling me to be a pastor. No, there's a formal sacramental means by which God calls and ordains men to the sacred ministry. So we worship God according to the plan that he himself has established, which is represented by the 7 sacraments of the church. And so in the second part of the catechism, we learned how to respond rightly to the gospel with respect to worship by means of the 7 sacraments and all that pertains to them. Thirdly, we have to respond morally to the gospel. We have to respond rightly in our actual behavior. And the way that we respond rightly is by, as Christ said in the Great Commission, teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. So it calls us into total obedience, that we actually have to be imitators of God. St. John says that in order to prove that we know Christ, we must live as he lived. We must obey his commandments. If anyone says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments, he is a liar, St. John says. The right response to the gospel requires that we actually become imitators of God, that we become like Christ. And so the third part of the catechism is devoted to explaining what the morality of the Christian life is. This whole idea of Christian moral theology, how to live. And what we find in that third section is an exposition of the 10 Commandments and of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. A full exposition of the moral life of the Christian faith. It's the third aspect of our right response to God's plan of salvation by bringing our entire life into order and harmony with God's will. That's the third part of the catechism. And then lastly, because our salvation is entirely dependent on God's grace, and we can only respond rightly with God's help, with strength that actually comes from God. Our salvation is dependent on us begging God for the strength that we need to become children of God. And so we have to learn how to pray in an acceptable way. And we see this in the New Testament. The disciples didn't just pray according to what was on their heart. They literally asked Jesus and said, Lord, teach us to pray. And Jesus didn't say, well, that's dumb. You can pray however you want. Just pray whatever's on you. No, Jesus said, okay, when you pray, say, and he taught us the Lord's Prayer. Now, the Lord's Prayer is said to be the greatest of all prayers, but it's also said to be a symbol of, or a form of proper prayer that's to be imitated in all of the church's prayer. And so in the fourth part of the catechism, we have a full exposition of the Lord's Prayer, which lays out for us an entire explanation of what acceptable prayer looks like and guides us to respond rightly with respect to this fourth aspect of a right response to the gospel. So true catechesis, to bring this to a close here, and I know that there's a lot to talk about that I could obviously, we could just talk about this forever. But what we see is the catechism teaches us all of the details of the 4 aspects of the right response to the gospel. And so catechesis involves teaching and actually practicing all 4 aspects of this right response. So as for ourselves individually, we have to ask, am I believing what I'm supposed to believe? Am I actually confessing the truth that has been revealed by means of the creeds? Am I confessing the true faith? Am I worshiping God in a way that he himself has approved? Am I worshiping God according to the 7 sacraments? Am I living according to the moral teaching of Christ, calling him Lord and actually meaning that he is not just the Lord, but my Lord, subjecting myself to his lordship? Am I living according to his commandments? And then fourthly, am I dealing with my own weakness and dependence? Am I honoring God as I should with acceptable prayer? Am I praying according to the approved methods of prayer that God has revealed to us through the church? And that includes the Lord's Prayer, it includes the Rosary, it includes Liturgy of the Hours, the liturgies, and so on, that the church establishes for us. So to catechize ourselves, or to be catechized, we need to learn these 4 things, not for the sake of a test, but we actually need to practice these 4 things. And so you see, there can be no separation of learning and practice. So to actually confess the true faith is to recite the creed, for example. To actually worship God acceptably is to participate in the 7 sacraments, in the sacramental life of the church. The way to respond to the moral teaching of the church is to actually amend our lives and to come into obedience to all that Christ has commanded. And the way to fulfill the 4th aspect of a right response is to actually recite the prayers of the church and to pray as we should, not just to know these things, but to do them. Now, when it comes to catechizing children, we see how this all applies. It's not just to teach our children about the human condition, about God's plan of salvation, about the faith, about worship, about Christian morals, about prayer, but to actually initiate them like an apprenticeship into those things. So to apprentice our children, to initiate them into responding with faith by reciting the creeds of the church, by initiating them into the sacramental life as the church teaches us to do. It begins at baptism, continues with their first communion preparation, first confessions, on to confirmation, and so on, leading them into the appropriate, approved sacramental worship of God. That's catechesis. The moral life, teaching our children Christian morals, teaching our children all that Christ has commanded, and also explaining to them the need that we have for God's help, for God's grace to be able to do that, which leads us obviously to the 4th aspect, which is prayer, actually teaching our children the prayers of the church, giving them the resources that the church has provided to actually guide their prayers and to teach them to pray, just as Christ originally taught the apostles to pray. So we can see catechesis, yes, it is instructional, yes, it is academic, it is intellectual, but it's also practical. It's also practical. And that's the question. The question is are we doing both of these things? And this is the challenge that I'm taking up in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's not enough to just teach your kids the Baltimore Catechism. That's not catechesis, because you're not actually initiating them or apprenticing them into the right response to the gospel. It's much more than just that formal catechesis. Now, it's also not just practice. It's not just going to church or just reciting your prayers without understanding, because the church also provides explanation for all of this. We're supposed to worship God in spirit and truth. We're supposed to understand what we do. And so it's the combination of these 2 things, not the separation of these things. Some people may say, oh yeah, we just need to focus on the truth. Well, that's part 1, great. But what about part 2? Are you also responding rightly with respect to the sacramental life? What about part 4? Are you also responding rightly with respect to prayer? What about part 3? Are you also responding rightly with respect to your Christian life? Someone may say, well, I'm a good person. I think I live according to Christian, but I don't go to church. Okay, so you're responding well with respect to the third aspect of the Christian life, but you're disobeying the second aspect of a right response to the gospel. That's what true catechesis requires, a complete instruction and apprenticeship with respect to all 4 aspects of a right response to the gospel. That's the challenge that we face. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what I'm working to do is first of all to take care of the instructional side of things, because that's real. We have to know and understand the human condition, God's message of salvation communicated through creation, human nature, and direct revelation. And that includes the whole classical Catholic curriculum, including philosophy. We've also got to study the sacred scriptures, which contain God's revelation for us, the Old and New Testaments. We've got to study sacred scripture. We provide for that in the academy. We've then got to learn the systematic teaching of the church, and we provide for that in the academy in a number of different ways. But then I think there's still some more. I think there's a need to address the will. I think there has to be some teaching that's studied as part of catechesis that is winsome and influential. And so recently, for example, I included, there's a course under our theology category, a course, St. Cyril of Jerusalem published a series of catechetical lectures back in like 350 AD. And those catechetical lectures were delivered to men and women who were preparing to enter the church as unbelievers entering the church. And they're very obviously very sound doctrinally, but they're also very, very moving emotionally and personally. And I think that's an important aspect of evangelization and catechesis that we have to emphasize. So I encourage everyone to study that course, the Catechetical Lectures of St. Cyril of Jerusalem. And then I'm also going to be including some other courses like Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales, which I find very attractive and moving. So there's some need for that arousal of the will and that provoking and directing in actual active response. There's also a need to participate in the prayer of the church. So you'll see that we've got courses under theology labeled the Holy Rosary and Liturgy of the Hours, where we actually provide students with the resources and guide and means of recording daily prayers in praying the Rosary, praying the Liturgy of the Hours, to promote not just a knowledge of the prayers of the church, but the actual participation in those prayers, the actual saying of those prayers. We also have a course on the lives of the saints that introduces us to the most famous and holiest examples of the Christian life, because we can learn from the lives of the saints to understand the Christian moral life in a practical way, in an applied way, by learning about the details of their lives and then by imitating them. And so that helps us with that third aspect of a right response. So to address all 4 aspects of the response that's needed to the gospel, that's what I'm trying to emphasize and provide in the theology courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Not just a knowledge of the Catholic faith, but the opportunity to actually begin practicing the Catholic faith. Now, obviously, I can't bring kids to church and things like that. I can't lead them. Actually, I can lead them in daily prayers, but I don't normally do things like that. But you can see the kinds of things that parents need to take responsibility for. bringing the kids to Mass, allowing the kids to participate in the sacramental life, and so on. Those are parent duties. Those are local duties. Those are things we can't provide through schools or by online learning programs, whereas much of catechesis we can provide, but there are certain aspects that can't be provided, and those really need to be focused on by parents. So anyway, I want to wrap this up because I'm already over an hour. But I hope that gives a good bird's eye view of what real Catholic catechesis consists of, what it needs to look like, not only for ourselves, but for anyone else that we seek to catechize, whether it's our children, our neighbors, and so on. To teach them these things, to help them understand these things, what their condition is, what God's message to them is, and how to respond rightly in all four aspects with respect to faith, with respect to worship, moral life or obedience, and prayer. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that this talk also serves as a starting point for some deeper discussions now as we get into these things. So if any of those issues that we've discussed here, any of them start to raise questions for you, or you say, oh man, that's one area I just don't understand, please send questions along, and I'll continue talking about these things, and we'll get deeper into them, because I know that many find these talks helpful, just to stir up thoughts and discussions while they do other things, while they drive to work, do housework, and so on. So if you've got questions you'd like me to explore in these talks, just send them along. My email address is wcm@classicalliberalarts.com, and I'd love to talk about these things. I'm going to continue to explain how I'm working to address these needs in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And as you know, my wife is studying in the Master of Catechesis program at Catholic University of America, so she's also studying and discussing these things with professors, and I'm sort of looking over her shoulder as she works through these courses to see what they're talking about, what the content is, and spin it my own way with respect to my own work and teaching. So anyway, anything you'd like to talk about, let me know, and we'll try to improve our ability to catechize ourselves and our children and neighbors as best we can, God helping us. God bless.